The grand recital hall of the Kensington Conservatory hummed with a soft, eager energy. It was a spring evening in 1987, and the air itself seemed to smell of polished wood, old paper, and a faint trace of nervous perfume. People filled the red velvet seats, programs rustling softly. They were here for one reason, to hear a young man play. Backstage, in a small, brightly lit room that smelled of dust and rosin, the young man was pacing. His name was Leo, and at 19, he was already spoken of in whispers and impressed nods throughout the music school. They called him a prodigy, a word he wore like a favorite jacket. It fit him. He could feel the nervous energy of the audience through the heavy curtain, and it didn't scare him. It fueled him. He imagined it as a kind of power, waiting for him to tap into it and transform it into sound. He stopped pacing and looked at his hands. They were his instruments, long-fingered and strong. He flexed them, thinking of the piece he was about to play. Chopin's Ballade? No, one in G minor. He knew every note, every dynamic marking, every fiendishly difficult run. He had practiced it until his fingers could find the paths in the dark. He wasn't just going to play it tonight. He was going to conquer it. He would show them speed. He would show them power. He would make the piano roar and weep under his command. The thought made a confident smile touch his lips. Dot in the opposite corner of the room, sitting on a plain wooden chair. An older man watched him. This was Professor Finch. Where Leo was all restless motion, the professor was stillness. He was in his late 60s, with a kind, tired face and hair the color of ash. His suit was pressed, but slightly old-fashioned. He had been teaching piano at the conservatory for longer than Leo had been alive. He watched his student pace, seeing not just the confidence, but the sharp edge of tension beneath it. The professor loved Leo's talent. Truly, the boy could achieve technical feats that made other students gasp. But for weeks now, a quiet worry had settled in the professor's chest. It was like listening to a brilliant speaker recite a powerful poem in a language he didn't quite understand. The words were all there, pronounced perfectly, but the heart of it, the reason the poem was written, remained locked away. "Leo," the professor said, his voice a low. Calm rumble in the small room. Leo stopped pacing and turned. "I'm ready, Professor. I can feel it. It's going to be electric tonight." "I don't doubt your readiness," the professor said carefully. He chose his words like selecting the right weight for a key. "Remember this piece. It is not a mountain to be climbed. It is more like a story to be told. A difficult, beautiful, sad story." Leo nodded, but his eyes were already looking past the professor towards the curtain. "Right, the story. The narrative arc. I've got it. The opening is the question, the middle is the struggle, the climax is the storm, and the coda is the resignation." He recited it like a lesson learned by heart. The professor sighed inwardly. That was exactly the problem. Leo saw a map, a blueprint. He didn't feel the ground under his feet, the weather on his skin. Chopin wrote this after his friend, the poet Mickiewicz, wrote a poem about a lost homeland, the professor said softly. It's full of longing, of a beauty that is remembered but can't be touched. So it's sad. Got it, Leo said, adjusting his cufflinks. I'll play it sadly. Before the professor could find a way to explain that playing sadly wasn't a technical setting like piano or forte, the stage manager, a frazzled woman with a headset, poked her head in. 5 minutes, Leo. The energy in the room shifted. Leo's focus became a visible thing, a tightening of his shoulders, a deep breath. The professor stood up, his joints protesting slightly. He walked over and placed a gentle hand on Leo's shoulder. The fabric of the tuxedo was smooth and cool. Just listen, the professor said, looking into the young man's bright, eager eyes. Before you play a single note, Sit for a second and listen to the quiet. Let the story find you. Don't just chase the notes. Leo met his gaze and nodded again, more seriously this time. I will. I promise. But the professor could see the promise was made to soothe him, not because Leo truly understood. The young man's mind was already on the keyboard, on the first crashing chords, on the applause he knew would come. Out in the hall, the murmurs died down as the house lights dimmed. A single spotlight warmed the beautiful black grand piano on stage. It looked like a sleeping creature waiting to be awakened. The audience, a sea of shadowy faces and glinting eyeglasses, fell into a respectful silence. The stage manager gave a nod. Go. Leo walked out from the wings. His steps were confident, sure. He acknowledged the audience with a brief, polite nod, no smile. He was in his zone. He sat on the piano bench, arranged the tails of his tuxedo, and placed his hands in his lap for a moment. The professor, watching from a narrow slit in the side curtain, held his breath. Listen, he thought, desperately hoping the message had gotten through. Leo's hands rose. For a second, they hovered over the keys. The hall was utterly silent. Then he began. The opening chords rang out, grave, slow, and serious. They were perfect. The notes were clear, balanced, profound. The professor allowed a sliver of hope. But as the music unfolded, that hope began to fade. Leo's playing was, as always, technically magnificent. The notes were all in the right places. The dynamics were observed. But it felt applied. The passion felt like a calculation. The sorrow felt like an idea, not an experience. He was performing the ballade, not living inside it. He was showing the audience how difficult it was, and how skillfully he could overcome that difficulty. The music moved from the thoughtful introduction into the first fiery theme. Leo's speed was breathtaking. His fingers were a blur, a machine of perfect precision. A few people in the audience stirred, impressed. They whispered to each other, incredible technique. The professor heard it, and his heart sank a little. He wanted them to be silent, to be pulled into the music, not to be admiring the mechanics of it. Leo pushed forward into the beautiful singing middle section. This was the heart of the piece, a place of tender, aching melody. It was supposed to sound like a memory, sweet and painful. But under Leo's fingers, it sounded pretty. It was smooth and in tune, but it lacked weight. It lacked the quiet tremor of something precious that was gone. He played the notes, but the space between the notes, where the feeling lives, was empty. The professor closed his eyes for a moment. It was a good performance. It was, by any standard, an excellent performance. Anyone else would be thrilled. But he knew what Leo was capable of, not just with his fingers, but with his heart. And he knew the boy wasn't even aware it was missing. To Leo, this was the music. The notes, perfectly executed, were the end of the journey. As Leo powered towards the famous, tumultuous coda, the final storm of notes, the professor opened his eyes. He saw the focus on Leo's face, the slight frown of intense concentration. He was about to tackle the hardest part, and he was going to win. He was going to play it faster and cleaner than anyone expected. The story of loss of a lost homeland had been forgotten. Now it was just a spectacular sprint to the finish line. The professor leaned against the cool brick wall backstage. The performance was not a failure. It would receive strong applause. Leo would be proud. But a deep sense of disappointment settled over him, not in Leo, but for him. The young man was in a room full of treasures, satisfied with merely reading the labels on the boxes. He had no idea what was inside. The final thunderous notes echoed through the hall. Leo struck the last key with a decisive force, his hands flying up in a dramatic finish. He held the pose for a second, chest heaving slightly from the effort. Then the applause began. It was loud, respectful, warm. It filled the hall. Leo stood up, turned to the audience, and gave a sharp, satisfied bow. A smile finally broke through his serious performance face. He had done it. Watching from the shadows, the professor applauded too slowly. The first part of the evening was over. The talent had been displayed, brilliantly. But the lesson, the real lesson about grace and what makes music live, was still waiting in the wings. It would arrive in the most unexpected way, carried not by a professor's advice, but by a whisper from the past. The applause for Leo's performance washed over him like a warm wave. He stood by the piano, giving another quick, stiff bow as the clapping continued. The sound was solid, appreciative. People were impressed. He could see it in their faces from the stage, the raised eyebrows, the nods, the kind of smile you give when you've seen something skillful. It was good. It was what he'd worked for. He turned and walked off the stage, the sound of the applause fading as the heavy curtain closed behind him, leaving him in the bright, bare light of backstage. The stage manager gave him a thumbs up. "Nice one, Leo. Real powerhouse." Leo nodded, a flush of satisfaction warming his cheeks. He could still feel the vibration of the final chords in his hands. He'd nailed the hard parts, especially that coda. No one could say he hadn't. He headed back toward the small green room, already running the performance over in his mind, cataloging the small flubs, a slightly rushed passage in the middle, maybe, but overall, it was tight. It was clean. Professor Finch was there, waiting. He was leaning against the doorframe, his arms crossed. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't frowning either. His face was calm, unreadable. "So?" Leo said, unable to keep the eagerness out of his voice. "How was it?" The coda felt faster than in practice. "It was very fast," the professor said, his voice quiet. "The technique was, as always, remarkable. You played every note." Leo heard the "but" hanging in the air. He felt the first little prick of irritation. He'd just given a great performance. Why was there always something? "But," he asked, his tone a little sharper than he intended. The professor paused, choosing his words. "It was a performance, Leo. A very good one. But I wonder if you heard the music, or just the notes you were playing. What's the difference?" Leo said, the irritation growing. He was still buzzing from the stage, and this felt like a letdown. "The notes are the music. I played them correctly." "Correctly isn't the same as truly," the professor said softly. He looked tired. "The middle section. It should ache. It should sound like you're remembering something beautiful you can't have back." "It didn't ache, Leo. It was just correct." Before Leo could fire back a response, the door at the far end of the corridor, the one that led to the main hall, opened with a soft creak. A sliver of the hall's muted light cut into the backstage gloom. Two figures appeared. One was a younger usher, a woman looking slightly flustered. The other was an elderly woman, leaning heavily on a simple wooden cane. They were moving slowly, very slowly. The old woman's steps were small and careful, as if each one required thought and balance. She was slight, dressed in a simple, elegant dress of deep blue that seemed from another time. Her white hair was swept up softly. Her face was a map of fine lines, but her eyes, even from a distance, seemed bright and alert. The usher was whispering, "It's perfectly all right. We have time before the second half. There's a seat right here in the back." The old woman didn't seem to hear the usher's reassurance. Her gaze was fixed straight ahead, not at Leo or the professor, but through them, as if she was listening to something else entirely. The clatter of her cane on the concrete floor and the soft, shuffling sound of her shoes seemed incredibly loud in the quiet backstage space. Leo watched. his argument with the professor forgotten for a moment. He felt a spike of fresh annoyance. This was his night, the climax of his semester. And now this interruption. A latecomer, and one who was moving at a glacial pace, disturbing the quiet. He needed to get ready for the reception afterwards, to hear what people had to say. He didn't have time for this. The old woman and the usher were moving between him and the professor, toward the curtain that led to a rear door of the hall. As they passed closest to him, the old woman stopped. Just completely stopped. The usher gently tugged her arm, but she resisted. She turned her head very slowly and looked directly at Leo. Her eyes were a pale, watery blue, but they held a startling intensity. They looked at him, at his hands still hanging at his sides, at his formal shirt, and finally at his face. Leo felt strangely seen, pinned by that gaze. It wasn't a proud look like his parents', or a critical one like the professor's. It was something else. Deep, knowing, and a little sad. Then her lips, thin and slightly pale, parted. Her voice, when it came, was not the weak, raspy whisper Leo expected. It was clear. It was papery dry, like leaves rustling, but every word was distinct. It carried in the quiet corridor. "You play," she said, not as a question, but as a simple statement, like a young man who has never lost anything. The words landed in Leo's stomach like a cold stone. He blinked, taken completely aback. He had no idea what to say. It didn't sound like an insult, but it didn't feel like a compliment either. It felt like a diagnosis. She didn't wait for a reply. Her eyes drifted past him, toward the closed curtain that still separated them from the silent piano on stage. A faint, distant smile touched her lips. "That middle section," she said, almost to herself. "It is not a storm to be conquered." She looked back at Leo, and her voice dropped to a true whisper, forcing him to lean in slightly to hear. "It is a memory to be mourned." Then she did something extraordinary. Very softly, barely louder than a breath, she began to hum. It was the main melody from the heart of the ballade, the very one the professor had just said didn't ache. But in her hum, it did. It ached terribly. The tune wavered slightly, an old voice not quite holding the pitch, but within that waver was a world of feeling. It sounded sweet and bitter, and full of a longing so deep it made Leo's breath catch. She hummed only 5 or 6 notes, a fragment of the phrase, but in those few seconds, the air in the dingy backstage corridor changed. It wasn't just a tune anymore. It was a story. Her story. And then, as suddenly as she had stopped, she moved on. She gave no other sign, no nod, no further word. She turned back, leaned on her cane, and continued her slow, shuffling journey with the usher. Through the door and into the shadows of the hall's rear. Leo stood frozen. He could still hear the ghost of that hum in his ears. He looked at the professor. The old man's face had changed completely. All the calm criticism was gone, replaced by a look of pure, stunned recognition. His eyes were wide, fixed on the spot where the old woman had vanished. "Professor?" Leo's voice came out quiet, confused. Who was that?" The professor didn't answer for a long moment. He slowly brought a hand to his mouth, as if holding in a revelation. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "That," he said, almost reverently, "was Eleanor Gray." The name meant nothing to Leo. He shook his head, still reeling from the woman's words. Like a young man who has never lost anything. She is, one of the greatest pianists this school ever produced, the professor continued, his eyes still distant. Long before my time. She was famous, Leo, not just for her technique, but for her sound. People said she could make the piano speak. She could make it sigh. She retired from performing decades ago. I heard she still lived in the city, but no one sees her. I haven't seen her myself in over 20 years. Leo tried to process this. A famous pianist? That frail old woman? He thought of her hum, that tiny, broken, beautiful sound. It had contained more of the ballade than his entire flawless performance. Why did she say that to me? Leo asked, the defensiveness gone, replaced by a hollow, curious feeling. The professor finally looked at him. Because she heard you, and she knew exactly what was missing. He let out a long, slow breath. She wasn't criticizing your talent, Leo. She was pointing to a door you haven't opened yet. The stage manager's head popped around the corner. 5 minutes to second half, gentlemen. Places, please. The spell was broken. The practical world rushed back in. But nothing felt the same. The satisfaction Leo had felt moments before was gone, drained away and replaced by the echo of that papery voice and that fleeting, aching hum. He had played every note perfectly, and a stranger had listened and heard only that he had never lost anything. It was the strangest, most unsettling review he had ever received. And as he stood there, the applause from the hall now just a memory, he realized with a jolt that she was right. He hadn't, not really. And for the first time that night, standing in the quiet backstage, Leo felt utterly, completely lost. The second half of the recital was a blur of sound to Leo. He sat in a stiff chair in the wing, the same spot where the professor had watched him earlier. But he wasn't really listening to the other performers, a violinist playing a lively piece, a cellist with something slow and somber. The music flowed around him like water around a stone. Inside, his mind was churning, a storm of confused thoughts and feelings. The old woman's words were stuck in his head, on a loop. You play like a young man who has never lost anything. At first, the sting of it had been pure annoyance. Who was she to say that? She didn't know him. She'd heard a few minutes of his playing and decided she understood his whole life. He'd worked for this. He'd sacrificed for this. He'd spent thousands of hours alone in practice rooms while other kids were out having fun. Wasn't that a kind of loss? The loss of a normal childhood? He clung to this idea, feeling wronged. But then he would hear her hum again in his memory. That frail, wavering sound. It hadn't been a criticism of his work. It hadn't been about hours practiced or techniques mastered. It was about something else entirely. It was about a feeling he knew he hadn't put into the music because he hadn't even tried to find it. He had been too busy building a perfect, impressive machine of sound. It is a memory to be mourned. What did that even mean? How do you mourn a memory at a piano? He played the notes Chopin wrote. Wasn't that enough? The frustration made him shift in his seat, his formal shoes squeaking slightly on the floor. He glanced over at the professor. The old man was listening to the cellist, his eyes closed, his head nodding slowly with the rhythm. He looked peaceful, completely inside the music. Leo felt a sudden, sharp distance between them. The professor had understood the old woman's words immediately. He lived in that world of feeling and memory. Leo felt like he was on the outside, looking through a window at a party he hadn't been invited to. The cellist finished. Polite applause filled the hall. It was good, solid applause, but it didn't have the same excited edge that his own had. Leo felt a petty, small satisfaction at that, which immediately made him feel worse. Was that what he was? Someone who needed to be better, louder, faster, just to feel good? The stage manager was moving quietly, getting ready for the final piece. The recital was almost over. Soon, there would be a reception in the lobby with little sandwiches and glasses of punch. People would come up to him, shake his hand, tell him how technically proficient he was, how impressive his speed had been. His parents would be beaming with pride. The professor would probably give a little speech. The thought of it all suddenly felt heavy, like a costume he didn't want to wear anymore. The satisfaction from his performance had completely evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, itchy feeling. He didn't want congratulations for something that now felt empty. He didn't want to smile and pretend. A wild, impossible thought flickered in the back of his mind. It was so reckless, it almost made him gasp. He pushed it away. It was crazy. It wasn't done. It would be an insult to the other performers, to the program, to the whole formal structure of the evening. The final performer, a flutist, took the stage. Her music was light and playful, a complete contrast to the storm in Leo's head. As the cheerful notes danced through the hall, his impossible thought came back, stronger this time. It wrapped itself around the echo of the old woman's hum. What if he didn't just accept this? What if he didn't walk out to the reception and pretend everything was fine? What if he tried again? His heart began to pound, a hard, fast rhythm against his ribs. It was a stupid idea. It was arrogant. It could backfire horribly. People might think he was showing off, or worse, that he was so arrogant he thought his first performance wasn't good enough, and he needed a second chance to prove himself. But was it arrogance? Or was it the opposite? Wasn't it admitting that the first one wasn't good enough? Not in the way that mattered? He looked at his hands, resting in his lap. They were the same hands that had flown across the keys with such certainty an hour ago. Now they looked like strangers' hands. Could they do something different? Not just play, but speak? Could they try to find that ache? The flutist finished her piece. The applause was warm, marking the official end of the programmed concert. The house lights in the hall came up a little. People began to stir, gathering coats, preparing to stand. This was it. The moment was passing. In another minute, the chance would be gone forever. He would step out into the lobby, and the night would solidify into a story of a talented young man who gave a great performance. The other story, the one about the old woman and the lost memory, would fade. He couldn't let it fade. Before he could talk himself out of it, before reason could clamp down, Leo stood up. His chair scraped loudly on the floor. The professor, who had also stood up to go backstage, turned and looked at him, puzzled. Leo? What are you? Leo didn't answer. He walked past him. He walked past the surprised stage manager, who was about to go out to make an announcement. He pushed through the heavy main curtain and stepped back out onto the stage. The bright spotlight was off. The hall was bathed in the softer, general lights. Half the audience was already standing, turning to leave. They saw him and paused, confused. A low murmur rippled through the room. His parents, sitting in the third row, froze. Their faces etched with surprise and worry. Leo felt every single eye on him. His mouth was dry as dust. His earlier confidence was gone, replaced by a terrifying, vibrating uncertainty. He walked to the center of the stage, to where the microphone stood. His footsteps echoed in the now quieting hall. He reached the microphone. He had to lean down a little. The metal was cool. He could see his own blurry reflection in the black foam of the windscreen. He cleared his throat, and the sound boomed awkwardly through the speakers, making several people jump. The murmur died. The hall was silent again, but this was a different silence than before his performance. That had been an eager, waiting quiet. This was a confused, held breath kind of quiet. His voice cracked. He tried again, forcing the words out. I apologize for the interruption. He looked out, not at individual faces, but at the dark mass of the audience. My name is Leo. I played earlier. A few people nodded politely. He saw his father give a small, encouraging nod, though his eyes were wide with confusion. Leo took a deep, shaky breath. There was something I didn't find in the music the first time. something I didn't understand. He was speaking slowly, stumbling over the words, trying to explain something he barely understood himself. I would like, if it's all right, to try the piece again. The Chopin. To play it one more time. A louder murmur went through the crowd. He saw people looking at each other, whispering. He saw the head of the music department, a stern-looking man, frowning deeply from the front row. This was not protocol. This was not done. Leo felt heat flush his neck and face. This was a mistake. A huge public mistake. He was about to turn and flee, to mutter another apology and disappear, when his eyes scanned the very back of the hall. There, in the last row, almost in the shadows, was a splash of blue. It was the old woman. She was sitting perfectly still, her cane propped against the empty seat next to her. She wasn't looking at the whispering people around her. She was looking straight at him. And in the dim light, he thought he saw her give the faintest, slightest nod. It wasn't permission. It wasn't approval. It was more simple than that. It was acknowledgement. She had heard his request. She was waiting to see what he would do. That tiny nod was enough. It was a thread to hold on to in the spinning room. Leo didn't wait for any official approval. He didn't look at the frowning department head. He turned his back on the murmuring audience and walked to the piano. He sat down on the bench. It was still warm from the flutist's accompanist. He placed his hands in his lap, just as he had before. But this time, he didn't think about his hands. He didn't think about the notes, the tempo, the dynamics. He closed his eyes. The professor's voice came to him. Listen to the quiet. And he did. He listened to the restless, confused silence of the hall. He listened past it. He let the old woman's words fill the space in his mind. A memory to be mourned. He didn't think of Chopin or Poland or lost homelands from history books. He thought of his own life. He thought of his grandfather's workshop, the smell of sawdust and oil, and how that smell was gone from the world now. He thought of a treehouse he'd had as a kid, and the feeling of safety inside it, and how he couldn't even remember when he'd last visited it before it was torn down. He thought of small, ordinary things that were lost forever, not in a dramatic way, but in the quiet way that time takes things. He felt the ache of those losses, not as a big tragedy, but as a gentle, persistent sadness. He opened his eyes. His hands felt different, heavier, more connected to the rest of him. Slowly, he raised them and placed them on the keys, and then he began to play. Not to perform, but to speak. The first notes were different. Before, they had been a statement. Powerful, clear, announcing the start of a performance. Now they were a question. They emerged from the piano slowly, thoughtfully, as if feeling their way into the dark. Leo didn't push the sound out. He let it rise from the strings, holding each chord a fraction longer, letting it vibrate in the air of the hall before it faded. The difference was so immediate that the last whispers in the audience died instantly. It was like someone had turned off a switch. People who had been half standing to leave slowly, quietly, sank back into their seats. They didn't move. Leo was barely aware of them. He was inside the music in a way he had never been before. His mind wasn't on his fingers, on the next difficult run, on the tempo marking in the score. His mind was with his grandfather. He saw the old man's hands, rough and scarred from a lifetime of woodworking, teaching him how to hold a chisel. Those hands were gone. The memory of their warmth, their strength, was what he poured into the gentle, rising melody that followed the opening. It wasn't sad in a crying way. It was sad in a loving way. The music became a portrait of something cherished that was no longer there. He moved into the first passionate theme. The first time he had attacked it. He had used it as a showcase for his speed and power. Now he didn't attack. He explored it. The notes weren't weapons. They were feelings too big for words. There was anger in it, yes, but it was the quiet, confused anger of a boy missing his grandfather, not the flashy anger of a performer trying to impress a crowd. His fingers still flew, but they weren't racing. They were searching. Every note had a purpose, a place in the emotion dot in the wing. Professor Finch stood absolutely still. One hand was pressed against the rough brick wall to steady himself. His eyes were fixed on Leo's back, on the curve of his shoulders. He wasn't hearing a student play. He was hearing an artist emerge. The sound was rounder, deeper. It filled the hall not with noise, but with presence. The professor felt a tightness in his throat. This was it. This was what he had hoped for, had tried to explain, but had never been able to force. It had taken a stranger's whisper to unlock it. Out in the hall, people were transfixed. They had heard this same piece less than 2 hours ago from the same young man. It had been exciting then. This was something else entirely. This was intimate. This was real. A woman in the 4th row, who had been checking her watch during the flute piece, found her hand frozen in her lap. She wasn't thinking about her schedule anymore. She was thinking about her own childhood home, sold years ago, and the particular way the light used to fall in the kitchen in the afternoon. The music was pulling memories from her own heart. Leo reached the middle section, the heart of the piece, the place the old woman had named. A memory to be mourned. He didn't play it sweetly. He played it tenderly, with a kind of fragile care, as if the melody was a precious breakable object he had found in an old box. He let the spaces between the notes breathe. The silence was just as important as the sound. In those tiny pauses, the feeling hung in the air, unresolved, aching. He thought of the treehouse, the specific smell of the sun on the old pine boards, the view of the world from up there, which felt like a kingdom. He mourned the loss of that simple, perfect feeling of safety. He didn't just play the notes Chopin wrote. He listened to what they were trying to say, and he answered with his own story of loss. The sound was clean, but it wasn't perfect. In his focus on the feeling, his technical control wavered just a little. A note here or there was softer than intended, a phrase blurred at the edges where before would have been razor sharp. But no one in the hall heard these as mistakes. They heard them as humanity. They heard the struggle to express something true. It was the difference between a machine-painted portrait and one done by a human hand. Where the slight trembles of the brush gave it life, the music began to build again, moving away from the tender memory towards a more turbulent, conflicted section. Leo's body moved with it, but it wasn't the dramatic, practiced sway from his first performance. It was smaller, more genuine. A lean into a difficult chord, a slight recoil from a clash of harmony. He was feeling it physically, not performing the feeling dot as the piece stormed towards its famous, furious finale. Something settled over the room. It wasn't just quiet. It was a deep, profound stillness. No one coughed. No one shifted in their seat. The rustle of fabric was completely gone. It was as if the entire audience had stopped breathing at once. They were not just listening. They were witnessing. They were being let into a private room. The air itself felt thick, charged with the emotion coming from the piano. Leo plunged into the coda. The first time, it had been a whirlwind of brilliant, controlled fury, a triumph of will over the keyboard. Now, it was a storm of the heart. It wasn't controlled. It was raw. It was the anger and confusion of all those small, personal losses finally given a voice. The notes tumbled over each other, a cascade of feeling. It wasn't neat. It wasn't clean. But it was utterly, devastatingly real. He wasn't conquering the music anymore. He was riding it, letting it carry him to a place he didn't know. His fingers pounded the lower keys, a thunder of sound. Then, with a movement that was almost desperate. He swept up the keyboard for the final crashing chords. He played them, and then it was over. The last note rang, a deep, resonant boom that seemed to hang in the completely motionless air of the hall. Leo's hands fell from the keys into his lap. He was spent. His shoulders slumped. He felt empty, but it was a clean, clear emptiness, like a room after a storm has passed. He didn't move. He kept his head down, staring at the black and white keys that were still trembling slightly. He waited for the applause dot. It didn't come. The silence continued. It stretched for 1 second, then 2, then 3. It was deeper and heavier than any silence Leo had ever heard. For a terrifying moment, he thought he had failed. He had done this crazy, impulsive thing, and it had fallen flat. The audience was confused, or worse, offended. The heat of shame began to creep up his neck. He slowly, hesitantly, lifted his head and looked out. What he saw made his breath catch. No one was moving. Not a single person. They were all just sitting there, frozen. An older man in the second row had his hand over his mouth, his eyes glistening. A younger woman was staring straight ahead, tears making silent tracks down her cheeks. His own mother was looking at him, but not with pride this time. With a kind of stunned, heartbroken understanding, as if she had just truly seen her son for the first time. They weren't getting ready to clap. They were still inside the music. The world Leo had created with the piano was still holding them, and they weren't ready to leave it. The silence wasn't empty. It was full. It was the deepest, most respectful response an artist could ever receive. In the back row, the old woman in the blue dress sat with her eyes closed. A small, serene smile touched her lips. She gave a single, slow nod, as if to herself. Leo sat in that powerful quiet, feeling it wash over him. He finally understood. The applause for his first performance had been for his talent. This silence, this breathtaking, holy quiet, was for the music. And for the first time in his life, he had truly let the music speak. The silence held the hall in a perfect, fragile glass bowl. It was a living thing, made of the echo of the last chord and the shared breath of 200 people. Leo sat at the piano, his hands resting in his lap, feeling the weight of that quiet. It was louder than any applause he had ever heard. Then, as if waking from a deep sleep, the audience began to return to the room. It started with a slow, collective exhale, a rustle of fabric, a soft, shuddering breath from somewhere in the dark, and then the sound came. It wasn't a clap that started in one place and spread. It was a wave that broke over the entire hall at once. It was thunderous. It was raw. People surged to their feet as they clapped, the seats flipping up behind them with 100 wooden bangs. The sound was not polite or appreciative. It was emotional, almost desperate. They weren't just applauding a performance. They were releasing the feeling he had poured into them. Leo turned on the bench, blinking in the brightening house lights. The sea of standing, clapping faces was a blur. He saw his mother, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, his father clapping with a fierce, proud intensity he'd never seen before. He saw the stern head of the music department, still clapping, his earlier frown replaced by a look of deep, surprised respect. He stood up, his legs feeling a little unsteady. He gave a bow, but it felt different. It wasn't the sharp, proud dip from before. It was slower, deeper, a genuine thank you. The applause swelled even louder, a roaring wall of sound that seemed to push against his chest. He looked toward the wing. Professor Finch was standing just in view, not clapping, but with his hands pressed together in front of his lips, as if in prayer. His eyes were shining whitely. He gave Leo a slow, profound nod. It wasn't a teacher's approval of a student. It was one artist acknowledging another. And then Leo remembered. He scanned the back of the hall, searching for the splash of blue. The seat was empty. The old woman was gone. A sharp pang of disappointment shot through him. He had played it for her. He had needed her to hear the difference. The applause finally began to soften, turning into a more sustained, warm rumble. People started to move toward the aisles, but their eyes were still on him, their faces filled with a kind of wonder. Leo knew he should go off stage, head to the lobby for the reception. It was now surely going to be a whirlwind. But he felt detached from all of that. He needed a moment. He slipped out the side door of the stage, the one that led to a narrow, dimly lit service corridor behind the hall. It was cool and quiet there, the concrete walls muffling the distant murmur of the crowd. He just needed to breathe, to let the enormity of what had just happened settle inside him. He was leaning against the cool wall, his eyes closed, when he heard the soft, familiar sound. Tap, shuffle, tap. His eyes snapped open. At the far end of the long corridor, near the exit door to the alley, was a small, stooped figure in a blue dress. The old woman was leaving. Wait! The word was out of his mouth before he could think. His voice echoed down the bare hallway. She paused. Very slowly, she turned around, leaning on her cane. She waited as he walked quickly toward her, his formal shoes clicking on the concrete. As he got closer, he could see her face more clearly in the dim emergency light. She looked tired, but her eyes were as bright and clear as before. He stopped a few feet from her, suddenly unsure of what to say. "You left," he said, his voice softer now. "I heard what I needed to hear," she said simply. Her papery voice was calm. That was because of you," Leo stammered, the words tumbling out. "What you said. I didn't understand it at first. But then I tried to find it." She studied him for a moment. "You didn't find it because of me, young man," she said. "You found it because you finally listened. You stopped telling the piano what to do, and you let it tell you what you felt." She gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug. "I just gave you the key. You had to turn it yourself." Leo nodded, the truth of it sinking in. "What was it?" he asked, the question that had been burning in him since her hum in the corridor. "What did you lose? To make you understand that piece like you do?" A faraway look came into her eyes. She didn't seem offended by the personal question. She seemed to consider it. "Oh, many things," she said quietly. "Time, mostly. Places. People I loved. The way a certain hall in Vienna smelled. The feeling of my mother's hand on my forehead when I was sick as a girl. The sound of a particular conductor's voice." She looked back at him. "You don't need one great tragedy. Life is a collection of small losses. The music holds them all. You just have to be brave enough to put yours into it." They stood in silence for a moment in the quiet hallway. The distant sound of the reception was a faint buzz. "Will you come to the reception?" Leo asked. "Everyone would want to meet you." "The professor, he said you were." "Legendary." A faint, amused smile touched her lips. "No," she said gently but firmly. "That is not my world anymore. This is your night. It belongs to you and to what you discovered. My part in it is over." She began to turn again. "Thank you," Leo said, the words feeling completely inadequate. She looked back over her shoulder. "Don't thank me. Just remember. The talent," she said, lifting her hand slightly to indicate his skilled fingers, "that is the gift you are given. The grace," she touched her chest over her heart, "that is the gift you give back. Never play a note without both." With another soft tap shuffle, she pushed open the heavy metal door to the alley. A wedge of cool night air swept into the corridor, carrying the smell of rain on pavement. And then she was gone, absorbed into the darkness. Leo stood there for a long time, staring at the closed door. Later, in the crowded, buzzing lobby, he was surrounded. Hands reached out to shake his. People he didn't know hugged him. His professors clapped him on the back. The talk was not about his technique. It was about the feeling. "You took us somewhere," one elderly man said, gripping his hand with both of his. "You made me remember my brother." A young student, her eyes wide, said, "I didn't know music could do that." Professor Finch finally made his way through the crowd. He didn't say anything at first. He just put a hand on Leo's shoulder and squeezed, his grip strong and steady. When he spoke, his voice was thick. "You found it," was all he said. "I had some help," Leo said, glancing toward the back of the hall. "We all need help to find the way," the professor replied. "But we have to walk the path ourselves. You walked it tonight." The reception eventually wound down. The goodbyes were said, the congratulations slowly fading. Leo walked out of the conservatory's front doors with his parents. The night air was clean and fresh after the storm of emotion inside. He didn't feel like a prodigy anymore. That word felt cheap and small. He felt quiet. He felt real. As they drove away, Leo looked back at the grand old building, its windows dark now. He thought of the piano sitting alone on the stage in the empty hall. He thought of the old woman making her slow way home through the quiet streets. He thought of the silence that had spoken louder than any sound. He knew then that this wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. He had learned a timeless lesson in that room, a lesson about talent and grace. And he understood now that his job wasn't to conquer the music that came before him. His job was to listen, to remember, to feel, and to have the courage to let all of that sing through his fingers. He had found a new voice tonight, and he would spend the rest of his life learning how to use it.